Hello, this is another revision video, this time for the paper 2 topic Health and the People, or Britain, Health and the People. And once again what I'm doing here is I'm going to take you through the whole course. There's a lot in it. Now I'm going to do that, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail, but I'm going to try and tell the story of the journey from medieval to modern medicine. This is a really good thing I would suggest to use at the start of your revision as a way of telling that story, and it will also, I hope, break down the course into easily manageable bits for revision. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, instead of you can be difficult sometimes when you look at a course, you can think, wow, there's just so much, but what this is intended to do is to try to break it down into manageable chunks. I would suggest that you perhaps watch it in bits, or at least you pause it and stop it occasionally. Those students, my students, will have their blank mind maps onto which they can add evidence. So this is a good overview, but it won't be enough for those of you wanting to achieve really high levels. However, for those of you who don't do an awful lot of revision, this will be a great way of doing some revision, and certainly something to watch in the run-up to the exams. Okay, so how am I going to do it? My plan is to do this in 4 parts. The course is in 4 parts, and I'm going to do it in 4 parts. Into each of those 4 parts, I'm then going to break it down again. So it's, when you're thinking of revision, how do I revise? We'll break it down into manageable bits. So the first bit we're going to look at is Medicine Stands Still, which is sort of medieval medicine, I guess, really. And as the name suggests, it's a period in which medicine and understanding of health really makes very little progress indeed. Then you've got the second bit, which is the kind of late 1400s, the Renaissance period, all the way through into the 1700s. And here you do see some progress happening, hence the beginnings of change. The third section is the so-called revolution in medicine, and again, hopefully that should be clear that what that means is there's going to be some big changes, and that is the 19th century. So it's 100 years, give or take. And then we're talking modern medicine, which is the sort of modern era, 20th and 21st century, where an awful lot of change happens. Okay, because this course is all about what changes, what doesn't change. Okay, so let's start with medieval medicine. Medicine Stands Still. What are the big questions? And I'll do this for each of the courses. What are the big questions that you need to think about when you are revising medieval medicine? Well, I would suggest the first one is, what were the main ideas about illness and treatment? The second one is, how did religion influence medicine in the medieval era, both Christian and Islamic? Thirdly, what was surgery like? And finally, how bad was public health, okay, in this era? Those are the 4 big topics, the way I would break down your revision. So I'm going to take you through each of those now. So the first part then is, well, what were the main ideas about illness and treatment in medieval England? And the key thing to establish here is there was very little progress made in this 300 or so year period. Who are the individuals you must know about that are important? You've got to know about Hippocrates. Though he wasn't a medieval thinker, he was a Greek thinker from hundreds of years before, but he has a huge influence on the thinking of doctors at the time. And of course, it's really important to understand the notion of the 4 humours theory. You can see what those 4 humours are on the screen, which was of course nonsense. But at the same time, it is possible to say that he was interested in the ideas of observation, which is useful, both pulse and urine, although they didn't really know what it meant. And of course, the Hippocratic Oath, still taken by doctors today, to do no harm. So not all bad. And then Galen is the other huge figure, again, from hundreds of years before in the Roman era. He develops this 4 humours theory. He's a believer in it, and he comes up with an adjunct to it, if you like, which is about the theory of opposites. So in order to balance the 4 humours, which is fundamental, you need to increase or decrease things which will allow those to be in balance. So he was a great believer in the idea of purging, and the notion of bloodletting, for example, takes hold and is very, very significant all the way through this era and right up until the 1700s. He was also an anatomist. He studied the human body, except he got quite a lot of things wrong, and there was people's understanding of the human body was not brilliant, because he used both human but also animal bodies, dissection not being allowed when he was doing it of the human bodies, or being frowned upon, let's put it that way. And so there were lots of errors made in what people believed about human anatomy. When we're talking about who treated people, remember, it's only the rich that could afford doctors, a very small number. And even those doctors anyway, their knowledge was very, very limited. It relied on the certain teachings of Hippocrates and Galen. And the church, the Catholic Church really controlled education at this point, and wasn't really interested, or so it wasn't interested in this country, in promoting new knowledge. Anything new was discouraged in Western Christian countries. It's also true to say that astrology played so superstition, the position of the stars and the planet, that informed treatment as well. So they weren't really working with accurate knowledge in both their diagnosis and in their belief about treatment. The vast majority of people, on the other hand, wouldn't even be able to go to these doctors, these university-educated doctors, and they would go to local wise women or men, or perhaps travelling healers, who again would have very limited knowledge. Some of it might be right, some of these herbal remedies might be right, but again, many of them wouldn't have been, and their remedies would be often supernatural and more sort of based on spells and charms. Now, if you wanted most minor surgical procedures, you would have to go to a so-called barber surgeon. These were people that effectively were trained to use knives. They were looked down upon by doctors. And a very common form of treatment would be bloodletting to balance the 4 humors, which they would do, which of course is not a valuable treatment. So what can we say about religion? Religion, incredibly important in people's lives in the medieval era, and really important in medicine too. Not all bad. I mean, the Christian influence was enormous, and there was a sense that, Jesus had taught that, caring for the sick was a duty of Christians. And so actually the church ran so-called hospitals of the day to care for the sick. And it's also true to say that the only way that any ancient medical knowledge was preserved was because of monks, who are some of the few people that could read and write at the time. But the church largely holds back progress. Illness is seen as a punishment from God, and therefore looking for cures was in some senses wrong. Pain was a punishment, so why would you try to avoid it? And in fact, what they suggested, what the church taught, was you should pray for forgiveness. And so therefore the hospitals that we talked about a minute ago were really about caring rather than curing. And there was this belief in the notion of pilgrimage as well, none of which is based in any scientific evidence. So, where can we see improvements or developments? Well, we can see it in the Islamic world, in the Islamic Empire, whose capital was Baghdad, spread all across the kind of what we would now call the Middle East, into North Africa and even into southern Spain. This area actually was an area where there was progress in all sorts of areas, science and arts and all sorts of things, including medicine. New knowledge travelled across this empire effectively, and the caliphs who ruled were encouraged learning, and they believed that it was a fundamental sort of role of Islam to look for cures and to accumulate knowledge about medicine and to develop new techniques for dealing with illness. A lot of the knowledge that was later came to the West, often through contact during the Crusades, came from these incredible library of books, the so-called House of Wisdom in Baghdad. And the hospitals were different from Christian hospitals because they were there to train doctors, and to look for cures. It's not necessarily they got everything right, but many of the great ideas that would later take hold in Europe actually were being thought about in the Islamic world as well. And there are some really important Islamic medical scholars you want to think about, like Razi, who was a prolific writer of books about medicine and had the courage to challenge Galen when that was something that most didn't, and was being able to identify certain illnesses. Avicenna, who wrote the famous Canon of Medicine, which brought together sort of all of the knowledge that was available to people at the time and was used for hundreds of years and went to Europe and was translated, listed the properties of lots of different drugs. Ibn al-Nafis, who was a really important person, although his famous idea didn't actually catch on at the time. But before William Harvey, who came later on, he was the first person to suggest that blood circulated around the body. So very important individuals there. Right, let's look at surgery. Well, we've already mentioned barber surgeons. And it's true to say that surgeons really didn't have any official training and they were looked down upon. What were the things that were fundamentally wrong with medieval surgery? Well, no effective painkillers, really. And as perhaps even more important, of course, no understanding of infection. And in fact, a belief that pus was good. Barber surgeons would operate in towns and villages, and they would also go on military campaigns as well, because you'd need your haircut as well as your wounds dealing with. And they would carry out common procedures such as bloodletting or amputation, because they needed to do operations quickly and simply, so nothing complex could be done. Trepanning, which is this idea that you will drill a hole in the skull in order to deal with mental problems, and cauterizing, which means burning, effectively using hot iron to seal wounds. It was pretty painful stuff for anyone having to go through it. Where they learned things was really out in the battlefield, particularly with the development of weapons like gunpowder, etc. New injuries developed, and therefore barber surgeons did begin to kind of try new things out, particularly towards the end of this period. And there were pioneers both in the Islamic Empire, but like Albucasis, and also in the Christian world, John of Ardern. And there were some pioneers, but they were in a minority, really. So let's do the final one here, which is all about public health. What do we mean by public health? Well, we mean the general health of the population. Now, of course, is something governments spend an awful lot of time thinking about, but in the medieval era, public health wasn't really something that the authorities took particularly seriously, and the towns were growing, and of course the problems that come with towns, overcrowding and large numbers of people and waste and clean water. So these all led to problems of public health. The mixing of clean and dirty water was one of the fundamental problems that was not properly addressed during this period. Cesspit, there were no proper drains, and there were certainly no sewers. So cesspits would overflow, rubbish wasn't collected, and there was also the mixture of not just people's waste, but tradesmen's waste as well. And of course, nobody understood the role of bacteria here. Now, it is true to say that there were some towns which were better than others. So in Exeter, for example, they had this Roman system for piping in clean water, which was more effective. You can still see it. There were privies in the attempt to separate dirty water, and some attempt in some towns to pass laws to clean the streets. But there was really no enforcement, and so it was very piecemeal and haphazard. The place you would find better attitudes towards public health were in monasteries, which were also large buildings. And there were several reasons for that. One, they were away from the town, and so they tended to keep away from the epidemics and the illnesses that spread quickly. And they saw it as their religious duty to clean themselves regularly, and they had the so-called lavatorium, the wash house, that allowed them to do that. They were also built in order to take waste away from the monastery. The privies were deliberately designed to take waste from the monastery, and there would be a separate clean water access. And of course, they were better educated than the general population, and so they had greater access to the ancient knowledge, which actually, obviously, which had some sense that, you know, to separate clean and dirty water was a really good thing. The one area we ought to focus on a little bit further with medieval medicine, of course, is the Black Death, which has a profound impact across the whole world and Europe and England, United Kingdom as well. What did people believe about this terrible plague? Well, they believed mistakenly that it was caused by miasma. Miasma is an idea that really lasts up and right through into the 1800s, this notion of bad air. They believed, because we've talked about religion, that it was a punishment from God, and they looked to the planets and the stars to understand it. And of course, there was also an attempt to blame it on scapegoats, so commonly, sadly, of course, the Jewish population who were blamed. Now, what did they believe in treatment? Well, again, treatment was very limited and in fact wrong in almost all cases. Linked to the religious ideas, they would whip themselves and ask for forgiveness and pray. And there were also some bizarre things like rubbing animals onto the buboes, the lumps. Moving away made sense, but the problem is it just spread the plague even further. Now, the truth was, of course, that this was a bacteria carried by fleas that were on rats, which were very common in these filthy conditions. It could also be spread by human-to-human contact, so you've got the bubonic and pneumonic plagues. Quarantines were very ineffective at this point, and you'll notice a difference later on when quarantines in 1665 are a little bit more effective. This has a massive impact on the country. The short term is probably about a third of the population die, and that leads to food shortages and price rises as a result, so you actually get starvation as well. And in the longer term, interestingly, there is some sort of big societal and economic changes. Now, one thing is that actually the peasants that are left are then able to challenge the feudal system, which had always had it that the lords were able to fundamentally control the great mass of people. But actually, given that those lords needed people to work on their land, now those peasants had much more control. There are fewer of them, and they were in demand. And this allowed them to start to argue and to barter with those lords and to gain more power. Not saying that they were as powerful, but certainly it was the beginning of the end of this system. And practically speaking, their wages went up as a result because the lords needed them. Lords were less able to keep them where they wanted them, and they were able to move and sell their labour. There's also this move towards sheep farming, and enclosure, which means the notion of, sheep need less people to farm, so that's a sort of change in agriculture. But there's also this interesting thing about the reputation of the Catholic Church being damaged, because the Catholic Church in many cases seem to be not helping, or to be and to have caught the plague themselves. So it appears to be that God is punishing those priests as well. So let's move on to the second section, which is the so-called beginning of change, which is a big period, over 300 years, from the late 1400s, or the so-called Renaissance, rebirth, right up until 1800. So what have we got here that we want to think about when we're breaking down our revision? Well, the first thing is, what was the Renaissance? And who were the key Renaissance individuals that begin to challenge the old ideas? The second thing is, how far did treatment improve? And again, it's going to be some improvement, but not entirely, during the 17th and 18th centuries after this Renaissance bit. We're going to look at the man Edward Jenner, who is really significant in this idea of developing a vaccine, which are so important to us today. So those are the three things. So let's start with Renaissance and those Renaissance individuals. Well, the Renaissance begins in the late 1400s in Italy, and it literally means rebirth. And it's a period when people are looking back to the old knowledge, looking for new things, and being inspired by that, but also looking to challenge those ideas and looking to develop them. Now you see this across all different fields. You see it in art, and you see it in music, and science, and you see it in medicine. Now, one of the really important things to bear in mind here is the invention of the printing press, which happens around this time, which allows for a lot of these ideas to be spread very rapidly. So an important idea. Who do we want to know when we're thinking about the Renaissance heroes, if you like? Well, one is a chap called Vesalius, who is a professor of surgery at Padua University in Italy. And he is one of the first people to challenge Galen's ideas on anatomies, which the church had held very sacrosanct, really. And he said, what we need to do is properly carry out dissections of human bodies, not rely on books or diagrams or things that Galen has told us. And he, therefore, is the first person to really give an accurate view of what the human body looks like. And this book, The Fabric of the Human Body, brings together all his amazing pictures. And this is, because of the printing press, has the ability to be reduced en masse, and barber surgeons and doctors across Europe are able to see this and learn from it. So whilst it may not have led to any immediate cures, it builds on the knowledge that is going to allow for, you know, much better surgery and treatment in the future. Who else do we want to talk about? Well, Pare, the most famous surgeon of his day. And again, a writer of books which are used as teaching aids. He is famous for his cream, and when we think about factors, this is the famous one where we say a bit of chance. He runs out of hot oil. Hot oil, traditionally used to clean gunshot wounds, has no impact. This hot oil, this cream he comes up with, actually much more effective and much less painful. He begins to use ligatures on the battlefield. That's not new exactly, but he recognised it could be more effective and less painful than cauterisation. And he also is famous for designing false limbs. Now, admittedly, they were not made on scale, but he's doing some of these extraordinary things that we would become used to later on. He builds on the work of Vesalius, of course, and he in turn inspires other surgeons, including Elizabeth I, Doctor, with his work. The other person we really need to know in this period, who's the kind of late Renaissance, you might, I guess, argue, is William Harvey. Now, we talked about Islamic's understanding of this early on, not catching on. Well, William Harvey is the first person to really prove and have accepted that blood circulates around the body. Now, like with all sort of great ideas, there is resistance at first, particularly to the notion of Galen's idea that that blood is made in the liver and then burnt as fuel. And people don't want Galen to be challenged. But he does, and by using scientific ideas of observation, dissection, experimentation, he proves this. And a lot of people don't like it, of course, because it would seem to suggest that bloodletting isn't effective, and bloodletting was a good money earner for many people at the time. Now, the problem is he doesn't really understand the purpose of this circulation. And again, whilst there may not be immediate new treatments, in the long run, this leads to a completely profound understanding of the way the body works, and therefore really important ideas for diagnosis and treatment. Okay, what about new and old treatments in the kind of later part of this section? Many old ideas persist, it has to be said. Bloodletting continues, although people are beginning to criticise it, especially after Harvey. But astrology is still there, and all sorts of sort of magical ideas like the power of the king's touch to heal. Most ordinary people, of course, don't really have access to much of any of the new knowledge anyway. They're continuing to rely on wise women, barber surgeons with little training, and so-called quacks who are travelling salesmen, effectively selling snake oil, selling things that aren't really real. But there are new ideas creeping in, not least because of the massive expansion of world travel that happens in the late 1500s, 1600s. So new things are being brought back from abroad, quinine, for example, being used for malaria, and new things are being tried out. So, for example, scurvy, which is a terrible disease that sailors catch because of they get because of a lack of vitamin C. They recognise that limes and lemons can be used to treat it. Opium becomes more popular as it's brought back, although it has significant problems as a painkiller, not least the problems related to addiction, but also because it dulls rather than completely gets rid of the pain. What can we say about the Great Plague? We talked about the Black Death earlier on. Well, the Black Plague of 1665 actually reveals just how little progress had been made in many ways. Miasma was still blamed. Bleeding was still seen as a treatment. Animals to draw out pus, all of these things which have no effect were still being used. But if there was one thing, it was the greater connection between the idea of filth and disease. Now, they didn't know why, but there was a much better effort by the local authorities to try to tidy up the streets. And the other thing they recognised is the importance of limiting the spread through quarantine. And what this tells us is government is beginning to act more effectively. And in fact, this plague doesn't really spread beyond London and its immediate environment. What else could we say? Another really important area I would suggest is the beginnings of hospitals as we now know them in the 18th century. And in fact, by the beginning of the 19th century, there are several hospitals in London which are treating up to 20,000 people a year, and they're not paid for by the government, they're paid for by wealthy individuals, and now many of London's hospitals were founded at this point, but they are providing free care for ordinary people. And they are providing training for doctors as well, and some of them were specialists, and they had specialist wards. Now, the truth be told, nevertheless, a lot of the treatments they're offering aren't wildly effective. Bloodletting continues to be used throughout the 1700s, but there are people that are pushing forward knowledge and understanding, and one of them is very famously John Hunter, who was a great pioneer in the field of surgery. And his scientific approach led to all sorts of different discoveries about things ranging from how to treat aneurysms, to how to treat STDs, to gunshot wounds, to all sorts of things, to dentistry. He was really was thinking about all sorts of different areas and how ideas might be changed. He was also a great believer in passing on knowledge. He had a huge specimen collection which he used to educate people about the human body. He also taught hundreds of other surgeons, including Edward Jenner, who then goes on to great success. So he was an extraordinary pioneer in the field of surgery in all sorts of different ways, and has a significant impact in the longer term on how we understand the human body. Now, Edward Jenner comes right at the end of this period, and he sort of spills into the 19th century area. And he, of course, is famous because he is seen as the father of vaccines. Smallpox in the 18th century was an absolutely terrible disease. In fact, it existed for a lot longer, and of course, Queen Elizabeth had it. There was no cure for it, and it could kill or certainly leave you very badly affected, perhaps with terrible scarring or even worse. And the only way that people had to try to prevent people from getting it was to so-called inoculate them, and that meant giving children usually a sort of what they hoped would be a weak dose by effectively giving them some of the scab from a smallpox scab. Now, it could work, and it could ensure that the immune system was able to fight a worse infection, but it was very nasty because it basically involved you getting it, and often it could actually kill you, particularly if the dose wasn't correct. So it was a very dangerous way to do things. Now, Jenner sees this, and he's inoculated himself when he's young. It's one of the motivations for coming up with a better way. And he's a doctor, a country doctor in the West Country, and he has what you could call a stroke of luck, or you could call his observation, where he recognises that some people who work with cows, milkmaids, don't appear to get smallpox when they get cowpox. And he looks at this and he thinks, are these two diseases related? And how could I come up with a better, newer form of inoculation, if you like? And so what he does is he experiments on a young boy by giving him some cowpox and then exposing him to smallpox. And the small boy doesn't get it, and it's a breakthrough because there's a recognised that you can do this much more safely. Now, as ever, there is resistance to his idea. He couldn't explain how it worked. And a lot of people made money out of inoculations. They didn't really want to do it. And even those that tried his system, they didn't really understand it fully. Some people died. So there was initially kickback against this. But over time, people begin to recognise how much better this form of preventing the spread of smallpox is than the old inoculation. When the royal family becomes vaccinated, that makes it even better, and people begin to accept it. And in fact, the government begin this process of getting actively involved in helping people, and this is sort of, if you like, in public health. In fact, they give him a grant for his research, and it even becomes compulsory as well after his death to have a smallpox vaccination. In the long run, the consequences are enormous, because we now know that vaccinations save millions of people every year. And of course, the COVID vaccine was developed at speed, and he is the origin, if you like, you could argue, of this. So we're now going to move on to the so-called revolution in medicine, which is the 19th century. And that, again, is going to be broken down into three parts. The first part is, well, let's think about germ theory. How did germ theory revolutionise medicine? Incredibly important, this question. The second one is, why was there a revolution in surgery? And the last one is about the revolution in public health. So it's kind of three revolutions that transform the way we think about health and medicine. So let's start off with germ theory, which is so important. Well, at the start of the 19th century, there was an awful lot of debate about why infection occurs. Now, scientists have had microscopes since the end of the 17th century, and they've been able to see microbes, but they really don't know what role they're playing, and there are debates about what that is. So there was a lot of discussion about so-called spontaneous generation. In other words, they believed that in fact infection caused bacteria to appear. Other people believed that all of them were the same, there was no difference, and both of these ideas were wrong. Now, there had been, before Louis Pasteur, people suggesting, no, it must be the other way round, that in fact bacteria causes infection, but nobody had fully proved it until a man called Louis Pasteur comes along in the middle of the 19th century. And he is actually working on food and drink, and he wants to know why food and drink decays. And he manages to prove through his experimentation that it is microbes that cause decay, and that in fact you can kill them and stop that happening. The so-called, with intense heat, the so-called pasteurization, which if we drink milk, it's being pasteurized to prevent it from making us ill. And again, we've said this a lot, isn't it? There is reluctance. People couldn't believe that something so small could cause so much damage. But his idea takes hold in the 19th century. And this theory then is applied by Pasteur and by another man who are German. Pasteur is French, Robert Koch is German, is applied to human diseases. And this is where it revolutionises our understanding of health. So Robert Koch applies Pasteur's theory to human diseases and begins to the process of identifying specific germs that cause specific illnesses. So anthrax is an example in 1876. He develops his own means to identify microbes through staining and photographing them. And these two men in the second half of the 19th century are basically competing with each other to identify different microbes. And then they inspire a whole group of other so-called microbe hunters who work for them or in association with them to look for specific microbes, and then looking for ways in which they could kill them. And the other thing they do is they then develop vaccines based on this understanding. And this is a game changer, because if you can develop vaccines to prevent people getting cholera and anthrax, you can save hundreds of thousands of lives, millions of lives. Within a decade or so of germ theory coming out, it is becoming accepted across Europe and in the United Kingdom. And it's men who, like John Tyndale, who is a British scientist who goes and lectures doctors to convince them that this is true and that they need to make use of this understanding in their work. In fact, it's a cattle plague around this time that really convinces people of the necessity to use this knowledge. Now, whilst this understanding was there, actually attacking infections deep inside the body, you could kill a microbe using an antiseptic of some kind, but how do you do that deep inside the body? That remained a problem until a man called Paul Ehrlich, who worked with Robert Koch, came along, and he developed the so-called chemical magic bullets. The first one, or the famous one, is for syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease. And so now this knowledge is being used to actually fight infection deep inside the body. Let's think about surgery then. Well, at the beginning of the century, surgery is a terrifying prospect for anyone who has to take part in it, because there really wasn't any reasonable pain relief. Yes, there was opium, alcohol had been used, but it's a terrible idea because of what it does to your heart rate. So really what they did is they had to hold people down and operate as quickly as possible. So really you had very simple operations, amputations largely, and surgeons themselves found it very difficult to operate under these terrible conditions. And in the 19th century that is transformed. There are new forms of pain relief, and all of them basically are united by the fact that individuals are experimenting, usually on themselves, to try to find methods by which they can reduce pain. The first one is nitrous oxide, but people don't really take it seriously because it's seen as a recreational drug in the 1840s. Then ether, which is much more effective and is proved to be effective in demonstration, in amputation, but it has problems. Not only is it very unpleasant to actually inhale, but it's also highly flammable. At a time when there were lots of naked flames around, it wasn't great. So the one that is really the first fairly safe and effective form is chloroform, used again sort of by accident really. Dr. Simpson is trying out different things. Apparently the bottle is knocked over and it knocks him out, and when they work out dosage, it becomes a very, very effective way of reducing pain and therefore, or stopping pain really, and therefore surgeons can then carry out much more complex, longer operations. As ever, there is opposition to something new for all sorts of reasons. There are religious opposition, that people think pain is part of, what people should feel. Some military leaders believe soldiers should man up and bear the pain. There are criticisms that women shouldn't take it during childbirth. It should be, this is part of God's plan, as some people would believe. But actually, most people come to accept fairly soon that surgery without pain is a really great thing. And Queen Victoria herself uses it, a bit like the vaccine, in childbirth, and that makes a big difference. Remember, the problem of infection remains, however, at this point. We're just beginning to get into the germ theory idea, so that's the other big problem that's going to need solving. So this is the next big problem that needs solving. And in this country, a man called Joseph Lister is absolutely fundamental to that. Now, he reads Pasteur's work, and he believes that he is going to be able to use that in his surgery. And he experiments by covering his equipment and his bandages, etc., in carbolic acid, and therefore he comes up with effectively what we would call antiseptic surgery. It's killing the germs in order to prevent infection. And he publishes his work, and it has a dramatic increase on patient survival after operation. And he points out that it is microbes in the air that are responsible for infection. The whole thing about germ theory, that there are microbes around us that can cause infection. And he shows how you can deal with this. Again, his ideas are disputed. Some of the people believing in spontaneous generation don't believe these microbes are there, just in the air. They believe they're created. That's a debate that is being had in the 1860s, 1870s. A lot of people don't want to use carbolic acid. A lot of people don't believe they've gone through a certain way of doing surgery, and they believe this is the way it should be done. But by the 1880s, his ideas are fully accepted, and the idea of aseptic surgery is being fully accepted. And then the development is to remove, is not just to kill microbes, but to stop them being in the surgical area, so-called aseptic, from antiseptic to aseptic. And that's what we would expect today. If we went into a surgical area, there would be no germs there at all. What about public health, another area of revolution then? Well, just like medieval towns were growing, well, in the 19th century, of course, they grew massively rapidly, really, really rapidly. And they came with all sorts of problems as a result. Industrial revolution. Factories become the new workplaces. People move from the countryside to the towns. But because of the lack of government involvement in planning for this, if you like, there were huge problems. Overcrowding, poor housing, terrible housing built very quickly to house as many people as possible, families sharing rooms, no sewers, people having to share toilets, share water supply, which was often contaminated. Again, rubbish collections not done. And in this environment, in this cauldron, so diseases like typhoid and cholera spread very, very rapidly. There are a number of very nasty cholera outbreaks from the 1830s onwards, where thousands die. Now, people begin to look at this, and the government begins to look at it and thinks, what can we do? We can't allow this to continue. And a chap called Edwin Chadwick, who's a lawyer, was asked to write a report into the living conditions of the poor, and his 1842 report is really important because it makes the connection fundamentally between poverty and illness, and states that the government needs to do things to improve the lives of the poorest, that it isn't their fault. And he suggests that medical officers are reported in each district, in each town, whose job it is to make sure that towns are clean. Now, he knows there's a link between filth and illness, but he doesn't know what it is. He's still a believer in miasma. But even after writing this report, there is resistance. A lot of people in government believe in the laissez-faire approach, the leave alone, that really they shouldn't be getting involved in the nitty-gritty of people's lives. Another man in the following decade, in the 1850s, John Snow, he wants to prove what he believes to be the case, that cholera is the waterborne disease. And he has a chance to do that in his famous water pump experiment in Soho in London, where he removes the handle from the pump, and suddenly people in the area stop dying of cholera, and he's able to prove that that is the source of the cholera outbreak. Again, he writes his report. Again, nothing is done immediately. But the combination of these things does lead, and the number of deaths of people dying from these cholera outbreaks, moves the government to start doing things. And it's particularly this massive cholera outbreak of 1848 that gets them thinking, right, we are going to establish properly a Public Health Act. Now, the problem initially with these Public Health Acts is it says that councils have to do things to improve the conditions of towns, but it's voluntary, and of course many don't, a bit like the medieval era. Then in 1858 there's a so-called Great Stink, in which the Thames smells so bad that they can't even sit in Parliament, these politicians, and they recognise something has to be done. And with this, Joseph Bazalgette, the great engineer, is charged with building the first sewer in London, and then that leads to sewers being built across the country, and that really wipes cholera out. The other really thing to bear in mind is, of course, this is a period in which people are fighting for the vote. And from 1867, most working class men begin to get the vote for the first time. And so the government knows it has to address, or politicians have to address, the needs of the poorest people. And so the 1875 Public Health Act forces councils to collect rubbish, build sewers, and supply fresh water for the first time. Now, the last section is so-called modern medicine, which is the 20th and 21st centuries. What are our big questions here? Right, well, our big questions are, how has treatment been transformed? So we've seen eras where very little has happened, and then we've eras where something has happened, and now we're really going to see where a lot happens. Again, we're going to look at surgery, how's that been transformed? And again, we're going to look at public health, so some good comparisons across the last two areas. So let's start off with one of the really crucial things you have to understand, and it's a really good one for the Q4 factors question. It's penicillin. Now, we know, don't we, that there were these microbe hunters of the 1800s, and we know that scientists had used this work to kind of look for ways of curing illness, and there was these magic bullets developed for things like meningitis. However, there was no magic bullet for a really nasty germ called Staphylococcus, and this had caused the deaths of lots of soldiers in the First World War who caught this after they were injured. And a chap called Alexander Fleming, he wanted to find out how to defeat this very nasty bug. And he was experimenting, and anyway, so the story goes, a bit of luck, he left some of this Staphylococcus out and went on holiday, and some mould drifted into his lab, through his lab window, landed on the petri dish with the Staphylococcus and began to destroy it. And when he came back from holiday, he saw this and he wrote it up. Sadly, he didn't do anything with it immediately. He wasn't sure quite how significant it was, but then it took two men in the 1930s, so-called Florey and Chain, to read his research and think, he was onto something here, and to develop it. And they carried out their own experiments using mice, and they proved that this mould, this penicillin mould, could be used to treat this Staphylococcus infection. And this is the first antibiotic, something that has treated millions and millions of people over the world, and most people will have had, and it's the first one. Very, very significant. The question then was, how do you produce it on scale, particularly in the Second World War, because the Americans and the British didn't want the same problems in the First World War. So the American government funded chemical companies to produce millions of gallons of this. And this is also the beginning of what we might call the modern pharmaceutical industry. They recognise the profits to be made in mass manufacture. And it saves hundreds of thousands of lives, and has done, not just for those soldiers, but those antibiotics have continued to do this. And so the mass manufacture of medicines really begins here, and now the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable in the world. Hundreds of billions of dollars made every year through pharmaceuticals. What about transforming other treatments? Well, technology is the watchword of the 20th and 21st century, as is government. Both these things really help aid the discovery of new treatments. Now, there's so many, and I will just mention a few here, but if you're thinking about understanding the body and treatment of disease, you've got all sorts of things from DNA mapping, incredibly important, screening, credible new machines to work out what's wrong with people, like CAT scanners or MRI scanners, credible new treatment, antibiotics and vaccines, for example, stuff like IVF to help people who couldn't otherwise have had children. Enormous strides forwards in surgery, I'll come back to later on, with things like organ replacements. There's also been a big interest in so-called alternative therapies, which many people dispute their efficacy. Things like acupuncture and aromatherapy, but people are looking for new things as well. And of course, the other really massive thing is there's a much greater interest in positive health, in living healthier, in exercising, in eating better, in all of those things, and in screening for problems before they, getting things early or getting things before they become a problem. And of course, life expectancy has shot up as a result in the 20th and 21st century. With this, of course, there are some dangers, and one of them is antibiotic overuse, which is leading to antibiotic resistance. And so one of the big focus of the future is in finding new antibiotics. Surgery, really important, and one of the things you want to think about here is about the impact of war in this period. Both the First and the Second World War have a profound impact on improving surgery. For example, in the First World War, there are portable X-rays developed to be able to look at men's wounds in the field. Amazing improvements in plastic surgery because of the new injuries. The ability to store blood for longer by using sodium citrate, and the army leg splint, which is still used to help nasty fractures. In the Second World War, we've talked about the mass production of penicillin, and also lots of things like new surgical techniques, such as in heart surgery. And of course, fascinatingly, the Grow Your Own Food campaign, although it was done out of necessity, actually led to a rise in healthy eating. It's not all positive, however. Of course, in war, research in non-war related injuries stops, and doctors are often taken away from their normal duties. And of course, there's just a significant number of casualties and the destruction of infrastructure that would help them. So let's just talk briefly about surgery again then. Well, anaesthetics and antiseptics discovered in the 19th century are now developed into very, very efficient things that really allow for much more complex in surgery with far fewer infections. You now have frequent organ transplants, which is extraordinary, heart transplants, even a face transplant, extraordinary what surgeons are able to do now and operate for hours and hours on very complex surgery. They're able to, of course, keyhole surgery has been another massive, massive jump forward. Use of radiation, for example, laser surgery, all sorts of advances made that have really means the modern era is one in which there is extraordinary transformation. And we mustn't forget transformation in terms of public health as well. Now, in the beginning of the 20th century, although people they've been talked about with previous reports, again it becomes clear that the public health of the citizens of this country is pretty poor. And one of the reasons that happens is because of two men writing reports, a bit like Chadwick's earlier on. One is a chap called Booth and the other one is Rowntree, and they're in separate cities. And they write these reports again showing very clearly how poverty is linked to illness and why it's the government's responsibility to do something about it. And this is also confirmed when the Boer War in South Africa reveals that the recruits who sign up, almost half of them are basically unfit to fight because of the conditions in which they've been living, their poor diet, etc. And it makes the nation look long and hard at itself and think, how can we defend ourselves? How can we compete on the world stage if our workforce is so unfit and our military is so unfit? And politicians begin to fear the UK would go into decline, particularly against a rising Germany at the time as well. The other thing to bear in mind is there's a political change. The Labour Party is set up around this time in order to support the rights of the working man and woman. And the other parties begin to fear that their votes, they will lose votes to them, so they know they have to do something about it. Something had to be done. So what do? Well, the first major step forward in public health are the so-called liberal reforms. The liberal reforms, led by Lloyd George, but also Churchill was a part of this at the same time. The Liberal Party introduced a series of reforms from 1906 to help the needy, and they're aimed at helping young people, and things like free school meals were introduced for the first time. They're aimed at helping older people, the introduction of a pension for those over 70. It has to be said, many people didn't live that long. And some support for the unemployed, and a new tax was introduced, national insurance, which we still pay, in order to support yourself if you became unemployed later on. Job centres were created. All these things we rely on now, we begin to see the beginnings of there. Now, the support is limited, but it's the beginning of it. And they start a long-term trend for greater government action. But immediately there are benefits, particularly in the field of child health, where you can see there are good diagrams to show that children are putting on good weight and that children mortality declines after the introduction of the liberal reforms. Now, this is, of course, really becomes important after the Second World War. So yet another war, and during the war in 1942, a man called Sir William Beveridge writes a report in which he identifies the so-called 5 giants that hold people back, that ruin blight people's lives: disease, want, ignorance, idleness and squalor. And he said it's the government's responsibility to address them and support them from cradle to grave. And this is what we would now call the welfare state, something we are well used to. When the Labour government is elected after the Second World War, their big project is the creation of this welfare state to ensure support from cradle to grave. And it is profoundly significant in the health of the people. And of course, part of it is about setting up of the NHS in 1948, providing free medical care to everyone, regardless of their wealth, which was a brand new thing. Not supported by doctors at first, who were worried about losing money. Of course, Nye Bevin, responsible for this, famously said he had to stuff their mouths with gold in order to have them accept it. But the reforms are really widespread, not just in the health service, but for children. Expansion of free education, dedicated children's health services, free doctors and hospitals for families, sick pay, subsidised medicines, maternity pay, council housing, really, really important. Much wider support for the elderly with pensions, for example. Now, there's a lot of discussion about the welfare state today. Is it too expensive? Is it too wide? Do we need to trim it back? Politicians are always talking about it. And the cost of the NHS and social care for the elderly and young people is vast. There's no doubt about it, but it has absolutely led to huge improvements in people's living conditions as well. And the thing now is that the government, of course, sees a principal part of its role is in keeping people well and healthy, which it didn't do before the 20th century, really. COVID, pandemic, which we have all lived through, is a perfect example of how the government spent billions in this country trying to keep people well and restrict the spread of infection. I hope that has been helpful to you, and all the best with your exams.